Today, we will try to zoom, and also tomorrow, on the impact of colonial era investments on roads and railroads mostly, the two aspects of infrastructure that have been studied the most by economic research, and try shedding some light on what we know about the legacy of extractive colonial rule that was pervasive, taking various forms in various parts of the continent. This kind of discussion fits into a broader kind of academic debate, mostly among Europeans rather than Africans, as we discussed last week, on what has been the more benign or the more malign views of colonization. So again, so here I decided to repeat a slide we saw last week. We have seen a couple of influential conjectures, not necessarily Africa-focused, trying to shed light on how the colonial intervention, to use this wording, shaped contemporary development, not only in Africa, but also in the Americas, Asia, Oceania, across the world. The challenge when one wants to shed light on such a very big question is at least twofold. First, it is very hard to come up with a counterfactual of no colonization, simply because most contemporary countries, to a lesser or greater extent, they were affected by imperial rule of some sort. Secondly, even those countries that were not strictly speaking being colonized, we have at least two in Africa, Liberia and Ethiopia, but of course some European countries, actually they were also affected by the modus and the mode of economic activity at the time. And to form this macro counterfactual, one has to think how African political and economic institutions would have evolved in the absence of colonization, something very challenging. And on top of that, as we have discussed in detail in week 3, and to some extent also in week 4, Europeans' modern intervention with the continent starts with the preceding to colonization slave trades that, as Nathan Nunn discussed, had lasting deleterious consequences for the continent. Now, the second key challenge is that colonization is, in a sense, a composite, or if you prefer, a bundle treatment. While Europeans were extracting, they were killing many Africans, among others, and they were stealing and looting its riches. At the same time, we had some infrastructure investments, as we will discuss today. And as we discussed last week with Catherine and Etienne and Douzier, there were also some investments by Christian missions, for example, or the administration on schools, clinics, and various other issues. And identify sources of quasi-random variation in those interventions to advance on causation. Identify the causal effect of, let's say, of building a road or building a colonial railroad or being very extractive, let's say, in one part of Congo Free State as compared to another part, and trying to advance in telling something about the causal effect. So let me start with, quote unquote, perhaps the positives of investments that took place during colonization, zooming into investments that took the form of railroads mostly, and a bit of road kind of investments. Now, let me say that at the time of European colonization, you had very opposing figures like Cecil Rhodes or Vladimir Lenin that thought, Lenin of course being extremely skeptical about colonization in Africa as in other continents, suggesting that at least the buildup of railroads would be something beneficial for the continent in the years to come, because at the time, a quite dominant conjecture among politicians and development scholars was the idea of the big push, that, you know, at some point, countries, regions, societies need some form of a big investment, and railroads and roads seems like this kind of investment, subject to very large fixed cost that is necessary to jumpstart economic activity. And actually, we have seen a lot of research in economics, not only looking in Africa, but looking elsewhere, among others also in the United States and the United Kingdom, trying to shed light on how industrialization does take place. Nonetheless, this optimistic view about colonization, and again, one aspect of colonization, eventually didn't get you very far, and the examples of Ghana and Mozambique illustrate that. So let me just pick Mozambique, a country which is very large, size-wise. For the Europeans, think about it as something like 1.5 times the size of Italy. Since I'm Greek, I tend to think that Mozambique is 7 times the size of Greece. Effectively, during colonization, we had 3 to 4 railroads, so very limited kind of investment. And also those railroads, rather than connecting the main economic hubs of Mozambique, Nampula, Nampula in the north, Beira in the center, and Maputo in the south, effectively, rather than connecting the big cities and initiating industrialization within the colony at the time, actually connected agricultural rich and mineral rich areas, actually in Rhodesia at the time or in Malawi, with the 3 main ports, because the objective of Europeans, at least in both actually of those 2 countries, was to transfer the resources from the inland into the ports and effectively in Europe and the industrializing Americas. In Ghana, effectively the strategy was the same. The mineral rich area with the Asante region with very long and a very well documented gold mines and deposit, as well as the agricultural rich area. The objective of the British administration was effectively to connect those areas with the ports and ship the goods out. So the research effectively conducts a couple of econometric or correlational kind of analysis, and what effectively those specifications, those positive and with star specifications illustrate is that in those places in Ghana that they were closer to the colonial railroads, recall those railroads were very, very limited. We see a boost in agricultural production, in cocoa production. We see a dense population activity and higher levels of urbanization. And actually this is quite important because there is a long tradition and considerable amount of research in economics revealing that we do have large productivity gains, mostly concentrated in big cities and large towns. So urbanization tends to go handy with riches, with economic development more generally. Nonetheless, as we have discussed actually by now quite a few times, it is actually quite challenging to interpret those correlations as causal for a very simple reason. The places where Europeans built the railroads were not random. As already discussed, those actually railroads connected important cities in the production of agricultural goods and also gold. So, in other words, the allocation of railroads was clearly non-random. So, a challenging issue is what can we do as researchers in order to advance on causation? And the idea that the scholars here, Remy Jedwab and Alex Moradi, had was effectively to delve into history, so read the colonial archives, read the historical accords about British rule in Gold Coast, and effectively realize that the administration actually had planned to build more rail lines, more railroads than effectively did. So what you see here is that you see the actual railroads that connect, for example, Accra to Tafo and Sekondi to Kumasi, but effectively you see also some other planned railroads that effectively were not built. So under the assumption that those railroads that were planned, they were designed, and there was a lot also of preliminary work towards building them, but in the end they were not built for some random kind of reason, then one could compare areas, let's say in the vicinity or nearby the roads that were effectively built to the vicinity or the neighborhood of those planned railroads that were not built, and effectively account for selection or account for the fact that in this case, the European colonizers were not randomly building railroads. And effectively, if you do this kind of analysis, which is what you see here in columns 6 and 7, you tend to find kind of very similar effects in the sense that those areas that happen to be close into those areas where the railroads were built did benefit considerably in terms of higher agricultural productivity, more dense population in the 30s and the 40s that persists till today. So to sum up, a significant body of economic research has tried to find interesting ways looking at placebos or looking what's happening on small villages that happen to be in between two main cities that the administration wants to connect with a main road or a main railroad to advance on causation. The evidence we have is that railroads and roads have sizable local effects, and those local effects tend to work with a mechanism that is already well understood in economics. You have a clustering of economic activity nearby the roads and the railroads, and you have some form of agglomeration kind of effect. Economic activity tends to happen mostly in cities, especially in manufacturing and services, and therefore we have the buildup of roads leading to local development, and of course, having some spillover kind of